Yeah, so I've met different people with different disabilities in my life. Like, my mom used to work for a deaf person, and she would bring me along, and the lady was able to read on my lips. So this is why kind of like the first time I met someone with a visible disability, at least. And we talked about disability a little bit in my master degree when we were talking about usability. And I had a student with a wheelchair in my class, and I discovered how even like when you are doing things on the usability and at a university, like people were so kind of ableist against my friend. I remember like there was one teacher who was talking to my friend as if she was 5 years old, like very patronizing. And we talked about disability a little bit in my master degree when we were talking about usability. And I had a student with a wheelchair in my class, and I discovered how even like when you are doing things on the usability and at a university, like people were so kind of ableist against my friend. I remember like there was one teacher who was talking to my friend as if she was 5 years old, like very patronizing. And at some point we snapped. Like another friend of mine was like, you know, she's in a master degree with all of us. Just because she's in a wheelchair doesn't mean she has like less cognitive abilities than we all do. So please talk to her like you talk to any other students. So I was like come on, that was very, very annoying. So I kind of had the unfortunately also a chance to see firsthand and like how people get treated when they have a disability. So like the concept of disability and all of that was something I understood, but I didn't really know when I was studying that was this thing called accessibility that was really focusing on how do we make things accessible for disabled users. You usually hear about like building accessibility, but not that much about web accessibility or like product services accessibility. So I kind of started digging into it via blog posts, via some conferences. And when I worked in France, the agency I was working for was actually specialized in accessible code. So they trained me in accessible code first, and then from the code I was like, yeah, okay, but it's nice that you do something in code, but if your mockups are not accessible, you already have a kind of single point of failure before that. Is the developer going to correct your contrast issues, for instance? It should not be the developer's job. So I was like, you know what, maybe designers need to know about accessibility too. And there were not a lot of resources at that time for designers. Like, I remember Laura Kalbach, she wrote a book about accessibility for everyone, and she, I think, was one of the first person who I saw was talking about accessibility, but also from a designer point of view. I was like, yeah, we need more resources. So I started kind of digging in and saying, okay, what can we do? What can we bring to the world to make this kind of more knowledge available for designers as well? Because you can fix a lot of issues already in the design phase. So that would be the idea.
Absolutely. And yeah, it's funny how you phrased it as kind of, you know, you had the chance, or rather the unfortunate chance, you know, to see some of these more ableist scenarios firsthand, or some of these major hurdles that a lot of disabled people have to overcome in order to use, not just use designs like in the context of digital environments, but really just to kind of live day-to-day life, which I think is maybe at the root of all accessibility nowadays. So I guess to backtrack a little bit, for those who might be newer to the field, how would you define like accessibility in UX? Because I know you mentioned there's accessibility in buildings. UX accessibility might be a bit different. So how would you kind of define it or make sense of it?
So it's about making sure that people with different types of disability can perceive the web, interact with it, and also contribute to the web. So it's not just about being able to consume the information, but like being able to also be part of the conversation, which is also very, very important. And often we think about blind people when we talk about accessibility. Usually it's the first thing that comes to mind. But there's kind of a lot of different disabilities, and there's also a spectrum, which means that people have different degrees of disability, and it's also not a fixed point in life. You can have a disability that will kind of move, some unfortunately degenerate, so get worse, but also at some point you have people who have temporary disabilities, like you might have an arm in a bandage or something like that, or you might have something like someone might have chronic fatigue, which means that in the morning they would be perfectly fine, and then all of a sudden in the afternoon they do not have any energy anymore, and maybe they need to have a wheelchair in the afternoon while they were walking in the morning. Or maybe you have someone with a cognitive disability who is perfectly okay at some point, and during the day they do not have any energy anymore, they get brain fog, and then they cannot do a cognitive task anymore. So it's kind of very important, I think, to help people understand it's a spectrum. So you have different things on the spectrum. You have auditory impairment, which are people with different degrees, again, of hearing loss. So here, if you think about design and UX, you think about, okay, we need to make sure that if we are designing Zoom, for instance, or like any video conferencing tool, we need to design a place to have captions. And if you're like working at Netflix, for instance, they had captions, but until I think a couple of months ago, you could not like configure them. So it was very annoying, because if you have like an anime with a very light background, the caption was white and it was next to impossible to read. So you might think like, yeah, okay, as a designer, there's not a lot of things I can do for people with auditory impairment, but actually there is. It's like you need to be aware of those things, and need to be aware of what what you can do in your interface to make things better. Then you have cognitive disabilities and learning disabilities. So this is usually things like dyslexia, ADHD, autism, but also people with brain injury, with mental disability, someone with long COVID who has issues with their cognitive capabilities. So here I think is the most understood one because it's very invisible. Unless someone talks to you about it, it's very hard to know that someone has a cognitive disability unless they are very open about it. And here I think as UXer, we have a lot of things to do because we work on information architecture, we work on UX writing, we can work on making tasks easier, we can work on memory. Like, we talk a lot in UX of the Miller law, it's like this magic number. This magic number is about memory. So there's a lot of overlaps when it comes to cognitive disability because often people in the UX field also are into the cognitive science field. And so there's actually a lot of things that can be done. And then physical disabilities, so this is what we think about too, like weakness, limited muscular control, like someone not able to use their mouse who might use a keyboard, or someone not able to use their hands at all who might use a head stick, so they will have a little stick on there and they will type or like put the stick on the touch screen, things like that. So here designers can think about guidelines for keyboard navigation, things like that, making sure that labels are properly labeled. If you think about someone who will control their screen with voice, they will literally talk to their screen, so the stuff in the screen needs to have names, otherwise they cannot say click that button that has a name, something like that. We have speech, which are people who have difficulty to talk. So again, often we think about muteness, but it also involves people with different levels, so like someone who stutters a lot, or someone who has maybe a facial paralysis that makes their pronunciation very hard. We have more and more tools with AI tool where you can talk to it, so like someone who stutters a lot, or someone who has maybe a facial paralysis that makes their pronunciation very hard. We have more and more tools with AI tool where you can talk to the AI tool. But if we do not train the model of people who do not have the perfect American English with different accents around the world, but also different disabilities,